trust is going to become a really heavy commodity with all these social media platforms now, and people are starting to say, well, if there's any element of distrust, or they're not listening to me or doing what I want them to do, and they just keep asking me questions, I'm no longer going to play the game. I wonder what you thought about that.
Well, I think trust has always been, an important part of how we communicate, how we interact with brands, isn't it? We want to feel that we can trust in a brand, and brand trust, as you're right, it's increasing, particularly as the world became very wobbly with certain leaders, certain, now the pandemic. So of course we needed to align. We need trust. We need that kind of anchor to keep us all balanced. I suppose what I'm really starting to hear, I was just on a call yesterday listening to a report that's just come out of Hootsuite. Like all of these big social platforms, they all do various bodies of research. We Are Social, do a digital report annually, and the Hootsuite one was I literally got sight of yesterday, and it was interesting to see that they were saying, like, this was big news, that actually what the consumer wants is really for brands to be listening to them, and that brands shouldn't be on there selling. They should be actually just listening and engaging. And for me, for 10 years I've been kind of like, hello, that's not what you should be doing. You should be doing this. And so I think the world of the brand side of things, they're waking up to what really the social media channels can be, and therefore the role that they play as part of the conversation, not just as advertorial platforms where they try and dominate, but actually pull back from that. There's been a lot of studies done, particularly over COVID, and there was one particularly done by Twitter where they looked at brand sentiment and what was happening around the last 6 months. And those brands that kind of stepped up and stopped advertising and actually just became part of the conversation, they saw a 3% increase in revenues and engagement, and in translating to 3% increase in revenues, because consumers don't want the big sell. They actually, if you think about it, as a consumer, you don't want to have a one-to-one relationship with a brand. We connect with human people, we connect with human beings, and so it's now, what is the role that the brands play, and trust is a big part of that. And trust, you've got to get people to know you, like you, haven't you, and then trust you. So I think they're joining that conversation.
Yeah, and I think the other thing about trust is really important when you're talking about internal social media networks too, right? Outside of Facebook and Twitter, but Slack and Microsoft Teams are social networks. So building trust when you get everyone to move into a digital space like that is so important too, because if you have a positive company culture, how do you know that you can move that online? And can you necessarily move that online? Because if you just have people log into a platform, there's no culture there yet. You haven't built any trust or rapport, or people don't even know necessarily how they're supposed to use that to communicate. So I think as we move digital more and more, it's really important for leaders and HR, people in the team, to make sure that they're really deliberately building a culture in those virtual spaces, and making sure that you're modeling appropriate behavior, positive behavior, trustworthy behavior. People know what they can say or what they shouldn't be saying online, and making sure you're building that trust with employees there, because don't assume it's just going to happen naturally.
Yeah, good point. It doesn't. And that's a point that we talk about in Myths, is the internal social networks are just as important, if not in some cases way more important for brands than the external social networks, because externally, realistically, brands are using them as ad platforms, and they can be very sophisticated targeting ad platforms, and there's no shame in that, at all. If that's done well and they're using it as part of their channel, no problem at all. But it's when it gets into that organic kind of conversation, and for whatever reason, whether it's customer service, whether it's community, whatever, their focus is on that, it's about how they're using it, and that does come back to how they're using it internally as well, engaging their own employees as influencers. Often there's a lot of great influence internally that organizations don't even tap into, yet they're going to outside influencers when actually some of their team members are way more influential potentially than the external influencers they're trying to do deals with, you know, and partnership with. So they are as important internally. And I think also from the communication side of things, as Ian mentioned there, I mean, haven't we all been doing so much more digitally? I mean, when we talk about digital transformation and what has accelerated digital transformation, it's been COVID-19, you know, it's been COVID-19. It has just catapulted organizations to have to become more digitally engaged, and programs that were maybe planned to roll out over the next 5 to 10 years have just had to happen. Otherwise business wouldn't happen. So in many ways, if there's any positive aspects coming out, it is that organizations have woken up to the power of digital connection, and that gives a lot more flexibility, doesn't it, to employees now, because we're likely to have a different work-life balance as we move forward.
Yeah, it's been interesting actually seeing this year, because I know just observationally some companies who were already fairly good in the digital space come March, April, didn't find it that difficult to transition when they already had the technology. People were already using Slack for normal conversations instead of email or anything else. Whereas some had to start completely from scratch, and they had to build it up and do the training and do orientation like people were almost new employees, right? If they weren't aware of the technology or didn't know how to use it. So there's been some kind of advantages and disadvantages depending on where people were in the digital space, I think, over the last year. But now everyone's having to catch up.